much of which, as I just said, I would call the golden age of journalism in China. You wrote the story Billions in Hidden Riches for Family of Chinese Leader, published in October 2012, about the fortunes of various family members of the then Premier Wen Jiabao. That story, David, along with a Bloomberg piece in June of that year on the wealth of Xi Jinping's family, I think were pretty much responsible for killing the golden age of journalism in China. So thank you very much. In Xi Jinping's words, that story, I think he particularly referred to as tying the bell to the tiger and kind of demanding that the New York Times do something about their error of their ways. It really pissed the Chinese government off. So the sting from that story and the Bloomberg piece, I think, are in some ways still being felt today. Can you tell us about that story, about writing that story, and how you and other New York Times colleagues were treated in China after it was published?
Sure. You know, I was a business correspondent in China, so I don't think I was, you know, seen as very, you know, they weren't focused on the business reporters. And it just turned out that in this investigation, I ended up at the family of the former prime minister, now Wen Jiabao. I can tell you after the publication of that, or even before the publication of that, when we went to the Chinese government, there was tremendous concern on their part. And in fact, lots of threats that if we went through with this story, the New York Times would have major problems in China, that I myself would have major problems and possibly be kicked out of the country. I was actually, I remember in the final days of working on that piece, I was in Tokyo because I couldn't really use my my Gmail account or my New York Times account because the government seems to have found out in the final weeks that we were working on this, and we're jamming my Gmail and sending security people around our building, threatening that they might actually get in and take some of these, some of the documents. So there was tremendous concern. We obviously went to the Chinese government and told them basically everything that we were writing. You know, before I wanted them to know, this is the story, this is what we're doing. And they called in, they sent someone to New York, you may know, to meet with Jill Abramson and the editors, and I think even maybe the publisher. And eventually I traveled to Beijing from Japan. I flew back to have a session with the government about the story before it was published. And I was again told, if you publish this story, you will be finished in China. And by the way, isn't your wife a Chinese? What do you think is going to happen to her if you publish this story? So there was, I would say, tremendous pressure before we published. After we published, you know the story, that we were blocked, that Chris Buckley and others were denied access to entry into China to be journalists for the New York Times for 3 years, actually. So there was, you know, this was really a major problem for the New York Times, for myself, for reporting. I ended up staying another 3 years in China, but I can tell you that there was a lot of harassment in the 3 years after that. And in the final year, 2015, I got death threats. I got a lot of pressure from the government to leave the country. And in fact, we got in the mail pictures of my wife and in text messages saying that something bad is going to happen to you and your family. And I called the government. I complained to the U.S. government about these tactics. And the Chinese government said, this has nothing to do with us. We're not behind these threats and photos being sent to you. But it was quite remarkable that you know, the week that I announced that I was leaving China, all of those threats suddenly stopped. So I think it's clear where the threats were coming from. And so it was, I mean, I had a great 11 years or almost 12 years in China, and was treated, I thought, very well for the most part, despite this episode. And so I don't want you to have the picture that I was that I felt my time there was like the government intimidated me all the time and threatened me. I actually had some of the best years of my life were in China, and I loved the country. I loved being there. But when you report on these kinds of things, it can turn pretty ugly. And I knew during that time that something like what we're involved in today, the situation with these journalists being kicked out of the country, I kind of thought in 2015 when I left that was very possible. I knew that it was the end of this golden age period, and the reporters that came after me or had been staying on longer than I, like Josh, they were going to have a very difficult time. And I felt when I left that I left at a good time to leave, because the surveillance and the difficulties became even worse. And I can say for my 12 years, I traveled around pretty freely in China. It was wonderful up to the Olympics. It started to get harder. And by 2015, I thought this is really, by the way, in the year 2015, I would spend at least 2 hours a day just cleaning my emails and my cameras and all the things that I was worried about that they did to try to make reporting difficult. That got worse and worse and worse. And in 2015, I would just walk to my car some days and there would be a police officer there. So what are you doing? And stop you at the airport. And slowly they were going to figure out ways to intimidate journalists. And we've seen that continue.
And in some ways get worse. As you just mentioned, I mean, in some ways, things started getting bad immediately after the Olympics. Once the promise of opening up was no longer necessary to maintain that charade. And my own former website was in fact blocked in 2009, which began my feeling that the golden days were over. Josh, you were in China, I think, from around 2007, I think. Is that right?
Yeah.
And from 2013, you have been reporting for the Wall Street Journal. And you've done some pretty amazing work, not only on issues like the Uyghur internment camps, but interestingly also on Chinese influence in far-off places like Uganda. Most recently, you were the deputy bureau chief in Beijing, and you are one of the journalists who has had the misfortune to be expelled. What can you tell us about the last 2 years as an American reporter in China, and what can you say about your untimely expulsion?
Right. Well, yeah, thanks, Jeremy. I mean, I'd say, it's interesting to hear David talk about, and you talk about the earlier, the sort of Hu era. I mean, in the Hu Jintao era, the sort of the pattern was that there were sort of these constant cycles of tightening and loosening, right? And so you would, and to me, it's sort of, I've always kind of felt like it was sort of like trying to walk down the aisle of one of those old like rickety green trains, and it's snaking through the mountains, and you kind of, it's tricky at first and you get knocked off balance, but eventually you sort of get the hang of it. You can anticipate when things are going to turn and sort of make your way through, right? And it's not so bad. I think in the Xi era, especially in the last couple of years, it's more like you're like on a high-speed train that's taking a sharp turn at 120 miles an hour, and everyone's plastered against the side of a train, sort of like a gravitron ride, right? And nobody can really move around or do anything, and they're just kind of hanging on for dear life. And I think that's really the case. I mean, it's these days it's forget insider sources. I mean, just interviewing academics, studying seemingly innocuous topics. It's too sensitive for them. They don't want to talk, and even sort of regular people. So yeah, I mean, I think it has gotten very, very difficult to report in China. As for the expulsion, unlike David, I was a little bit caught off guard. I mean, I guess I wasn't experiencing the death threat, so maybe I didn't see this coming. But the sort of proximate cause for my expulsion, I was expelled with 2 other colleagues at the Wall Street Journal. We were the first ones to be expelled. The reason they gave initially was this headline in our opinion section that was, frankly, a a bad headline in my opinion, but that none of us had anything to do with. The Chinese government knew about it. So at the time,
that was the sick man of Asia headline.
Sick man of Asia headline, yeah. And at the time we had a couple of visas coming due in the bureau, and sort of what they've been doing for the past couple of years up until now is just not renewing visas, which is sort of a de facto expulsion. But so we thought, I thought the worst that could happen was that one of my colleagues whose visa was up that week was not going to get it renewed, and I was actually at MOFA, waiting for my bureau chief to come out of the meeting with MOFA about these visas, when he had this kind of sheet, his face was white as a sheet, and I was like, oh, what, they're not renewing the visas? He's like, no, you're gone, you're kicked out. So I was totally shocked. I mean, they hadn't really expelled anyone since 1998. And in the post-Mao era, there'd never been multiple expulsions of reporters from the same news organization. So, and they didn't really say why. I mean, they didn't explain why beyond the headline, they didn't explain why they'd chosen the three of us or anything like that. I mean, I think on the whole, I take it as a sign of the Communist Party sort of feels like the cost-benefit analysis of dealing with particularly American media has shifted now. I sort of suspect it has a little bit to do with decoupling, but I mean, obviously some of these trends have been going on for a while.
Thanks, Josh. Let's shift gears a little bit and come to this side of the Pacific. So, Jiayang, the topic of this panel is journalistic Cold War, and you are somebody who I would say finds yourself right now stuck right in the middle of this Cold War. In New York, you've been cursed on the street as a Chinese bitch or something for bringing COVID-19 to America. Meanwhile, nationalistic Chinese trolls are harassing you on the internet and exposing the addresses of your relatives and saying all kinds of awful things about your mother, and saying that you're a traitor to China because of what you write, which is generally not the most sort of anti-Chinese stuff around, of all people to pick on. So you yourself have become part of the story, just as in some ways David and Josh did, because of their now troubled relationship with the Chinese government. How do you deal with becoming part of the story as a journalist? And if you want to fill in any detail on your struggle between the Chinese trolls and the New York racists, please tell us.
Right. Thanks so much, Jeremy. It has been a very strange month, maybe longer than a month since COVID hit New York City pretty badly, and I've been living here for going on a decade now. I think that as a Chinese American, this is one of those moments that really tests your the kind of the probational nature of your identity. I know that an immigrant is a fairly new concept, just in the span of modern history. An immigrant to a place where I don't look like the majority population, and as someone who makes a living from writing about my birthplace. I think that's, I'm a writer for the New Yorker, and I think I'm the first China correspondent who is ethnically Chinese, and that is a strange role to inhabit. But I have always felt tremendously grateful, and that this opportunity is possible, and that I am able to write from that place of being both Chinese and American. That has been, one of the greatest privileges of my life, and something that I didn't expect to do when I was reading, the great China, correspondence, when I was in high school and college. I do find this moment to be one of great reckoning, as in my neighborhood in New York City. racial incidents have increased. And I'm very, very aware of being a Chinese American. I'm aware of my Black hair. I'm aware of my yellow complexion. I'm aware of being a person of suspicion and someone to be feared and someone to be frustrated with as possibly a cause for all the ills and the calamities that has descended on the US. On the internet, I'm not really active on Chinese social media, but I do have a Twitter account and a Facebook account and an Instagram account. And as Chinese trolls have migrated, scaled the Chinese firewall and gathered at my various social media platforms to spew attacks, I've also felt the vulnerability of my position as an immigrant, someone who adopts liberal values and someone who believes in democracy as imperfect as it is. And this couldn't be a more imperfect moment in the US for democracy. I do think that these last few weeks, I've almost been paralyzed as I try to think through my identity as a writer in this moment and the very fraught traps that lie before me. There are moments when, after you read hundreds of death threats, they're not really serious. They're probably not like what David experienced, but they do come into your inbox. They do come through every which channel, descriptions of graphic ways that the stranger on the internet would like you to be tortured and raped and murdered. There are those times when the question lies before you to choose a side. And I've gotten that from Americans and from Chinese, that question from every which direction. This is your moment to choose a side, and you are criminally negligent for not choosing a side. And of course, there's such temptation when there are, when my mother, when there are death threats for my mother, to say, well, I absolutely deplore the authoritarian regime that has led to just this, the false narrative that then, resulted in me being trolled in this way. But I think for me, that would be the ultimate loss. I think if I agree to choose a side and to see China through a particular lens that's in reaction to the personal insults that have been thrown my way, I think I'll know that I'll have lost my professionalism as a journalist, and I think I'll have lost really maybe as a human being and as a Chinese American. So these are a lot of the quite inchoate thoughts going through.
Inchoate, but I think we all can sympathize. If we can't feel your pain, this is a tough time. To go back to the question of foreign correspondents covering China, how are American media going to cover China now? The Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. David, you yourself have a new project of your own, The Wire China, which is based out of the United States. And Jiayang, you've been writing about China based in New York since you started your current job at the New Yorker. So perhaps I could start with David. What difference is this going to make, having a much reduced footprint of American journalists in China? And what can American media do to ensure that we still cover the country properly?
Yeah, I think it's going to make a huge difference. Obviously, not having reporters on the ground inside China that's just major. I can't imagine. I was there almost 12 years. That the things you get from being there a lot. just living your life there is being inside of China is different from traveling occasionally to China. So I think it's pretty devastating to me to think that some of the best news organizations will not have access to China, and that is going to we're going to have a different situation with the kind of reports we get out. But I also think that even from my own situation when I was based in China, I thought, you do the best journalism you can do, and whatever happens, happens, and you figure out how to deal with it after that. And I think, the reporters did the best that they could do. They reported on very sensitive topics, and the government decided that we're not going to have that for a while. And so we're going to have to figure out, just like you do in investigative reporting, people often ask me, well, if you do these investigative stories, isn't that going to close all your doors and change everything about how you do research? And I say, I have to deal with whatever consequence it is. And as a journalist, you have to find new ways to report. And I have to say, with Jiayang, going in and being able to tell different stories from different perspectives, we can report on China from outside of China, from some people from inside of China. Of course, this is not like 1989. There's actually an internet, so we can get some information. There's social media. It's pretty bad news, but it's not absolutely it's not decoupling where we have a separate internet and we have a separate country and we can't make calls there. So I think we're going to have to adapt, the journalists that cover it. I'm covering it now from outside of China. I actually think there are benefits from covering it outside of China, which is I'm not followed all the time. I'm not going to be, censored. I'm not going to have my sources them walk in my interviews for the, like they did in China. And so I think the future of covering China is thinking about it from lots of different perspectives. And that means even when we did have great correspondents in China, you still need people outside of China covering China, because China is a global issue. It's not just what happens inside. So I think actually we have some of the best people writing about China that we've ever had. And I remember when I went into China in 2004, going back and reading all of the New York Times stories written about China from 1986 or about 1986 to 2003. And there was a lot of great reporting, but I would say what you've seen in the last 10 years about reporting in China is just, I'm in awe of all the voices and perspectives that we have, the diversity of the coverage today. I wouldn't trade that for 1986 or 1996 or even 2006. So I think we are in some ways in the best position we've been in despite this big setback.
Josh, maybe I could somewhat change the question for you. As I mentioned at the top, you have already been doing reporting on China from outside of China. For example, that story in Uganda that I mentioned. Are you going to be doing more of this kind of thing? And what do you think about the idea that some have proposed on the internet that the Chinese government might actually come to regret this move, because you have a bunch of motivated reporters who know China really well and now don't have to worry about surveillance and are free to go all over the Belt and Road and dig up all the dirt?
Right. Well, yeah, I don't know if I don't know if the Chinese government is going to regret this or not. But I mean, I do think that what China is doing in other parts of the world is an immense and immensely undercovered story. I mean, China is there are thousands and thousands of ways that China is sort of large and small and seen and unseen, that China is changing how the world works. And you can argue about what its motivations are in doing that, but it's definitely happening, and it's something that news organizations have only in the last couple of years really started to pay attention to in a serious way. And I think there's a ton of ground there to cover. Like you said, from my own experiences reporting on China outside of China, it's pretty liberating to be able to move around and talk to people. And Chinese people outside of China are much more open and willing to talk. And yeah, so I mean, I think that's going to be a huge area of coverage. I'm really excited about it, frankly. And you know, in terms of covering China from outside of China, you know, I think the reporting on Xinjiang that people have been doing, a lot of that involved, you know, satellite imagery, it involved document searches, involved data. I mean, these are things you, as David was saying, you can do that from outside of China now. And I mean, it's obviously a huge loss to not have as many. I mean, there still are reporters in China. You should make sure.
If I can answer the question, we have now a bunch of questions in the Q&A, and thank you. I'll try and get to as many of them as possible. One of them was for you, Josh. Are you still working with your sources and colleagues who are still in China? And if so, how has your work changed?
Well, yes, I'm still working with them. I mean, I'm still actually the deputy China bureau chief. I'm just doing it from an apartment in Tokyo where I've been stuck since my expulsion. So, and I'm mostly editing these days. So, I mean, all this sort of coincided with a bit of role change for me, which I guess was fortuitous in some ways because I don't need to be in China to do my current job necessarily. But no, I'm still working with them. I mean, we're making do. We're down to, you know, we went down from like I think 10 to 4 correspondents as a result of this. So, you know, I mean, we still have 4, which is good. And we're trying to figure out exactly how that's all going to work now.
I have a question from a veteran of the foreign correspondence scene, Jaime Flor Cruz. The recent expulsions were in part because of good reporting, but in part also tit-for-tat response to the US administration virtually expelling Chinese state media reporters. So a question for all 3 of you. Do you think the US move was justifiable or reasonable and positive in the long run? Jiayang, why don't you start?
I'm pretty pessimistic about tit for tat diplomacy. I think that there's such defensiveness on the Chinese side, and there's a sense of being pushed into battle, justifiably or not. Now, I don't condone the retaliatory measures on China's side. They feel frankly juvenile and possibly down the road to be counterproductive. But to your question, Jeremy, earlier about how we should pursue how we should pursue China correspondence in the days ahead, I think is against a backdrop of this devolving US-China relationship. Decisions made by politicians who are reckless and unstrategic. And I'm thinking of both Xi Jinping and Donald Trump here. We have 2 men, possibly 2 of the most dangerous men to be in the positions that they are in now, determining the most important geopolitical relationship in the world. And I think that makes it all the more important for journalists to be acting, I think, as courageously as possible when they're doing the kind of investigative reporting that David did, but also cautious. And I'm saying this primarily for someone like myself who reports on a lot of cultural topics and makes generalizations about China. I think one thing I tell myself is to understand the psychology that underlies so much of the antagonism and the tensions between the 2 countries. That's not to go soft on China. That's not to parrot the communist line. But I think that I am all the more, I feel the need to be all the more careful in reporting just the facts, and when I'm making generalizations about China, a complicated country at any time and by no means uniform, to be making sure that those observations are textured and hold the kind of complexities that is that's true of a country of 1.4 million. I know that strays a little bit far from from Jamie's question here, but I think that I think that the U.S. move, even if it is justifiable, I don't think I don't believe that it has. I don't believe that it does anything positive for U.S.-China relations. And I also think that as journalists, that makes me feel like it's my responsibility, there's a greater responsibility on my part to explain China in a way that doesn't prop them up as kind of, this beast that is, woven out of stereotypes.
We can talk a little bit more about stereotypes in a bit, but Josh and David, do you have any comments on just the decision to kick out the Chinese state media? Was that a mistake, do you think, or not?
I can give it a little try. I think it was the reaction. You could have predicted the reaction with that, and in fact. Back in 2013, when the Chinese government signaled to the entire New York Times staff, I mean, that was actually, this is the first time they've gone through it, but in 2012, I had reported on the Prime Minister's wealth, and they were quite angry about that and blocked our site. In 2013, we continued to write very sensitive stories, and in, I think, November or December of 2013, the Chinese government told us that the entire New York Times was going to be kicked out in December. We weren't going to be renewed, and buy your flight tickets now. And I remember it went down to the final weeks in December before we got our visas renewed. And there was discussion about what the US government should do. In fact, I think it was late 2013, Vice President Biden visited China, visited Beijing, met with many of the journalists. Josh may have been there. We had a meeting with him at the St. Regis Hotel off the record to talk about, he had just met Xi Jinping, the situation with American journalists, because it was not only the New York Times, Bloomberg and others were feeling pressure and not getting their visas. I thought that was, and there was the debate. We actually talked about, what should happen. And I think there was a pretty broad conclusion to be very careful about, kicking other people out. Maybe there could be, an effort to not grant visas to certain people coming in, but that anything that was too obvious could just lead to a quick retaliation. And that's unfortunately what happened in this case. I would say, if it is so easy to predict that their first move is going to be to kick out, maybe not the organizations that they kicked out, but even one journalist, you would have to think about, okay, do we really care about a state media person being in Washington versus, some of the best journalists in the world? So I think, unfortunately, that was just too predictable. And I can understand that they wanted to do something. They wanted to show that the U.S. was tough, but I think picking on these very unimportant media outlets doing work in the U.S. and putting at risk some of the best reporters in America was, that's not a choice. If they had asked me, I would be like, don't do that. You're going to have a reaction in months. And this was the worst time to do that because of the COVID-19, because of the relationships had gotten worse and worse and worse. And so I would say, do not target those things that will lead to an obvious reaction. So I think it was a mistake to do that.
We have a few questions along the lines of, is this just going to carry on getting worse, or do you see possibly tensions, reducing between the United States and China and things opening up again? Josh, as the one who's most recently come from China, what's your sense? Are we in for a long and very rough ride, or is there some kind of hope that tensions between the two countries might somewhat go down and that China might be somewhat more open towards foreign media?
Right. Yeah. You know, I mean, that's been part of the speculation around these expulsions. There's people sort of trying to explain what the party could possibly be thinking with this move. And you know, one of the most popular theories is that the Communist Party is confident that Biden's going to win, or it hopes Biden is going to win, and it's going to go to him with this gift of renewal of media access as a sort of, you know, in honor of his inauguration or something along those lines. And you know, that may be the case. You know, I mean, the way that Biden is now running his campaign in a very sort of anti-China way, I'm not certain that they're going to feel that much better about his administration. I mean, it'd probably be a little bit more consistent than the Trump administration has been in terms of how it treats China. But anyway, I mean, I think it's gotten very hard to predict the Communist Party, and I'm not sure I want to stick my neck out in quite that way. So I'm going to punt to Jiayang or David on that.
Yeah.
Well, on another topic, also, you know, we have a few questions kind of circling around this. What is the main gap in Americans' perceptions of China, and how can that gap best be bridged? And perhaps I can also just add to that. I mean, I've heard Jiayang previously talk about often foreign media coverage of China can feel like an X-ray, which is an accurate photo of somebody's body. It shows the bones and the organs or whatever you're focusing on, but somehow it misses out the flesh and, you know, the blood. It's not really the whole thing. And to an extent, that I think is still a problem. I mean, if you see a lot of American perceptions of China are very stereotypical, and maybe it wouldn't be the case if they read every Wall Street Journal and New York Times and New Yorker and The Wire story from you know, beginning to end, but most people aren't going to do that. So, I mean, what is the gap in Americans' perception of China, and what responsibility do we have in the media to fill in those gaps?
Right. I might take a you know, try to answer this one. I think that it was disheartening for me to hear some of my best friends, who I consider, you know, well-educated and with, you know, advanced degrees, talk about, you know, well, isn't COVID all China's fault? Like, at the end of the day, isn't this all China's fault? And as a China reporter, isn't it your responsibility to make it clear that all the virus traces back to Wuhan? It is China's fault. And yes, we shouldn't be discriminating against Chinese Americans, but we need to hold China responsible for reparations. And of course, I mean, all of us know about China's secrecy and many, you know, its month-long attempt to, you know, keep the news of the virus out for as long as out of the public's eye. But I find it concerning that it's all China's fault narrative, the simplicity of it, spreading like fire through the West, especially at a time when I think anti-China opinion is at its, at I think its highest in quite some time. I worry about the Western public's ability to distinguish between the Chinese government and the country. That is not to say that, you know, it's the evil party and the virtuous people. I mean, I don't approve of that, you know, very simplistic distinction. But I think the complexity of that relationship between the country and the government is one that the West does not adequately understand. And I think, frankly, Chinese history, its modern history, this sense of humiliation and defensiveness is one that at least, you know, many of my friends who are not China reporters can't fully grasp. They think, well, China is, I mean, it's the giant rising in the East, and they have all, they're there equipped with their agenda to take over the world. And that is a narrative, I think, that obscures so much of so many of the grievances that China has felt, and China's need, I mean, in its own narrative, to even the playing field, to really be an equal partner to, I mean, with, or I guess, a fighter against the West. I think, you know, the nuances of China's psychology is one that is really important for Americans and those in the West to understand, because then I think when they're listening to the campaign slogans of either Trump or Biden, or, you know, whichever politician is standing on the bully pulpit, it can help them contextualize those pronouncements about China, so they're not, you know, so they're not ignorant followers to, you know, these sound bites, so that they can't analyze for themselves China's evolving relationship with the West.
Okay.
Can I jump in there just for a second and support her statement that I mean, I think one of the wonderful things that we have now is, especially in the New Yorker, a lot of step back and context and calm your soul, which is harder to do in I would say the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, is to put things in perspective when you're on deadlines and writing the breaking stories. And I think what we actually need more of now, because it is such a volatile issue, it's actually, to me, quite scary to be back in the US and to see this kind of like the evil empire of China, and everyone is, you know, it's going to become very quickly, anything Chinese could be, you know, my wife is Chinese, she could be part of the evil empire. So I think it's the duty of journalists to ask great questions, to hold people accountable, but also to help readers see some of the context and the diversity and the complexity in stories. And what I worry about as a journalist is that we simplify too much and it just becomes a blame game. And I just had a long interview, which is why I was a little late for this session, with Kishore Mahbubani, who's written about how, you know, has China won? And he's talking about, you know, all the things wrong with America and why China is on the rise. And I think what we really need to do is constantly step back and say, what are the complex issues at work here? Calm yourself down about what's going on and think it through and try to think about it from different perspectives. Now we've had, I think, as I said earlier, a tremendous amount of diversity in the coverage of China versus from the, say, 80s or even 90s. But I think we still have a long way to go, because actually when you see the reception of your reporting, even though you think your reporting is complex and diverse and all those things, sometimes the readership makes you wonder, well, am I telling the right story? Why are the readers reacting in this way? I remember being in China in 2007 and writing about melamine and in American dog food and how there were food safety problems. And I did a call-in show, I think it was on NPR, and the response from some of those listeners, what they were saying about Chinese, I couldn't believe that this was the reaction to my story. And so I felt quite guilty that, you know, I'm writing these stories, but some of the readers are saying, you know, don't Chinese eat dogs? And, you know, is this a terrible thing about China? It was completely extreme in those reactions. And I think we have to recognize as journalists that the message is not always going to become come clearly through. And so how do we improve the coverage, make it diverse, look at it from different perspectives, and try to give people some better context? I think that's really what we need to do in this time. And even the politicians are going to be reacting in very simplistic, in good versus evil ways. And I think that is a very dangerous thing.
Indeed. On another topic, just sort of a crystal ball gazing question. Are any of you concerned that the crackdown on foreign journalists in mainland China will eventually spread to Hong Kong? And I mean, I would say perhaps it already has with the last year's visa denial for Victor Mallet, the Financial Times correspondent. But Josh, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is absolutely a worry, right? I mean, one of the most surprising elements of the expulsions was this notion that we couldn't go to Hong Kong afterwards, right? So, for example, after David wrote his story and Chris Buckley couldn't join the Times, and I think Austin Ramsey also was planning to join the Times in China and ended up going to Hong Kong. I mean, the New York Times was able to base reporters in Hong Kong because it had a separate system, right? And they were able to do some great reporting there. And when I was told that I was going to be expelled, that was one of the things they said was no Macau, no Hong Kong, and it was just kind of unbelievable. I mean, it was clearly
the government said that. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs said that.
Yeah, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs basically said that, and then they came out and said it publicly when they expelled all the other reporters. I mean, they actually mentioned it, and so that to me, I mean, it's a sign that the party does not see one country, two systems as an impediment to its control over foreign media in China, or in Hong Kong rather. So yeah, I mean, I think most news organizations in Hong Kong are probably now making contingency plans, because I think it's I mean, that's a clear signal if you add that in with what happened with Victor Mallet being kicked out effectively of Hong Kong. I mean, I think it's quite a worrying sign. And if you look at the tremendous coverage of the Hong Kong protests that came out last year, I mean, it was just really amazing journalism, visually and print and everything. I mean, that's exactly what the Communist Party doesn't want in Hong Kong, right? And so I think it, very well, I would not be at all surprised if this started to have effects there.
Here's another question from one of the audience. What effect do you guys think the censorship of journalism like the New York Times, etc., has on Chinese citizens these days?
Sorry, you got cut off. What was that question?
Was a beep. What effect does the censorship of American media, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, have on Chinese citizens, I guess, inside China these days?
Well,
because I mean, it's hard to remember the golden days when the New York Times launched a Chinese language version
right.
that was actually readable in China. Can you imagine that?
Yeah.
Would you like to take a stab at that, David?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say, because even in the golden days, not that many Chinese could read the New York Times in English or Chinese, right? There was a very limited number who were really reading us. I mean, it was a tiny, tiny percentage. Even though we weren't censored, you could deliver the International Herald Tribune or the Asian Wall Street Journal in China. You could only deliver them to foreign hotels and foreign residences. So it's not like we were out there on the streets and people could get it, but it was easier to get it. And obviously, if you're a foreigner and you're in China, you could read it. So I'm not so sure that I would say there's been any dramatic effect, because lots of Chinese study in the US and they can read us when they're outside of China. Some people can still jump over the firewall, but we never really deeply penetrated. What the hope was that the papers and the publications could eventually penetrate a larger audience. But I would say it was too early to say it had a significant impact, unless you're saying, the 60,000 people, say, who might have been reading were cut off. It's still a tiny percentage.
Right, and that 60,000, they probably have virtual private networks and
right.
I don't know, Diane, what would you say? Because I mean, the trolls that attack you, from what I've read in your writing and tweeting on it, some of them clearly haven't actually properly read what you write.
Right.
They kind of know who you are. They know what the New Yorker is. I mean, how do you see the effect of censorship of Western media on Chinese people's perceptions of America and the way Americans perceive China?
Right. I mean, I think I would agree with David that I'm not sure that many Chinese people were reading The New Yorker even before the New Yorker website was censored, I think maybe half a year ago. I do think that the online censorship of opinions, I mean, on social media, if voices questioning the state media or asking questions about, things that things gleaned from, CNN or the New York Times, if those voices are being muted, then we can imagine that the ecosystem of Chinese social media, it pretty much, becomes pared down to echo chamber of Chinese media voices. I thought it was really interesting reading through some of the comments of my trolls that, frankly, I don't think many people were reading the news at all. I mean, I think they were at best skimming even state media. I think through the popularization of social media and sound bites, people emotionally react or affirm narratives that have already been cultivated in their heads. So when they see my face, and then when they see this label, anti-China, ethnic Chinese, who's ashamed of her Chinese face and who is sucking up to her American imperialist father. I mean, usually actually, it's even shorter than that. I think it stokes rage and fury that prompts these trolls to migrate over to Twitter. So I don't. My greatest worry is that the news is not being read. Obviously, Western news is not being read, but sometimes I think the holes in Chinese, even in state media, are so blatant that if you read it line to line, and we're trying to construct sort of in your head, like how that story makes sense, an intelligent person might say, like, something is not adding up. But unfortunately, nationalism has become so fevered and rabid that it drowns out, I think, that rational faculty. I think my experience with this recent incident of trolling is that no one even knew. I mean, people didn't know if I had COVID or my mother had COVID, or what were the circumstances of us getting COVID. I think it was just Chinese face in America, member of the Western media mafia. This is someone that we're going to go after. The narrative is that simple, and there is not very much processing of news at all from any direction.
Okay, we're nearly out of time. I'm going to ask one more question that's kind of asking all three of you the secrets of your trade in a way, is if there's one story that's undercovered or that you think deserves more attention in China, what would it be? Putting you on the spot a little bit. Josh is wrinkling his brow. Anyone? No, this is asking too much. This is asking to see what's coming up next week. All right. Well, Jayan, Josh, and David, thank you very, very much for taking the time. And, for those on the East Coast, a relatively noxious hour of the morning. And thanks for taking your evening, Josh. This was a really informative panel. Thank you also for the very active Q&A session from our audience. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions, but this has been great. And I think we all look forward to reading more work from all three of you, despite these very, very difficult times.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much.
Thank you, Jeremy. Yeah.
Take care.
Yeah, take care, everybody.
Okay.